Every war has a moment when the lights go out, not metaphorically, but literally. Right now, the Persian Gulf, the corridor through which nearly a third of the world's seaborne oil passes, is sitting at the edge of that moment. Iran's military commanders have not been speaking in whispers. They have been broadcasting a warning loud enough for every capital on Earth to hear. Close the Strait of Hormuz, and the energy lights of the modern world dim with it. That is not posturing from a weak nation. That is a calculated message from a regime that has spent 40 years building asymmetric capability precisely for this kind of standoff. But here's what most of the coverage is missing entirely. While Iran is projecting power outward, toward the Gulf, toward the tanker lanes, toward the oil markets that feed Western economies, something else just happened inside Iran itself. Israel struck a facility in Tehran that wasn't on the public map. A hidden facility. And when Israel hits something it doesn't announce beforehand, it means the intelligence was precise, the target was significant, and the timing was deliberate. This is not two stories running in parallel. This is one story, a strategic pressure campaign operating on two fronts simultaneously. And the world you wake up in tomorrow depends entirely on which side blinks first. So let's slow this down, because speed is the enemy of understanding when it comes to the Middle East. People see the headlines, they feel the anxiety, and then they move on to the next notification. But that's exactly how empires and regimes want you to consume geopolitics. Fast, shallow, and powerless. We're not doing that today. Let's talk about Iran first, because Iran is the axis around which this entire story rotates. The Islamic Republic has been living under the weight of sanctions for decades now. The economy has been hollowed out. The currency has collapsed more times than most people can count. The young population inside Iran is restless, angry, and increasingly disconnected from the ideology that the 1979 revolution tried to plant in them permanently. The regime knows this. The hardliners know this. And when a government is under that kind of internal pressure, it does one of two things. It either opens up, or it reaches outward. Iran has been reaching outward. That's not an accident. That's survival strategy dressed up as foreign policy. The Strait of Hormuz threat is the sharpest instrument in Iran's toolkit, and they know it. About 20% of the world's total oil supply, and close to 30% of global liquefied natural gas, moves through that narrow choke point. It is roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. And Iran has spent years, not months, years, positioning naval assets, missile batteries, and drone swarms specifically designed to contest control of that strait. They didn't build that capability for decoration. They built it as a deterrent, and right now they are waving it like a flag. Now here's where most analysts make their first mistake. They look at the Hormuz threat and they ask, would Iran really do it? And then they spend all their time calculating the economic damage to the West and conclude, probably not, because Iran needs oil revenue too. And that calculation is correct, but it's incomplete. Because the actual purpose of the Hormuz threat in this moment isn't closure, it's leverage. Iran is sending a message to every party simultaneously. To the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have been quietly deepening ties with Israel, it's a reminder of their vulnerability. To Washington, it's a reminder that any escalation has a price tag that shows up at the gas pump in Ohio and Texas. And to its own domestic audience, it's theater. It's the regime saying to its own people, we are still powerful, we still matter. The world still fears us. Never underestimate the domestic function of geopolitical theater. It is one of the oldest tricks in the authoritarian playbook, and it works every single time. But then Israel moves, and the whole calculation shifts. When Israeli intelligence identified a hidden facility inside Tehran, not in the south, not near the Iraqi border, not in some distant province, but in Tehran, the capital city, the symbolic heart of the Islamic Republic, that strike carried a message that went far beyond the physical damage caused. Israel was saying something very specific to the Iranian leadership. We know where you are. We know what you are hiding. And the distance between knowing and acting, for us, is shorter than you think. Now, you have to understand the layers of psychological weight that carries inside the Iranian system. Tehran is not just a city. For the Revolutionary Guard, for the Supreme Leader's apparatus, for the entire architecture of Iranian state power, Tehran represents a kind of sacred inviolability. Foreign armies don't reach Tehran. Foreign intelligence doesn't penetrate Tehran. That is the self-image, carefully cultivated and fiercely protected. And when Israel puts a strike inside that perimeter, a precise strike against a hidden facility, which means they had human intelligence or signal intelligence deep enough to locate something the Iranians themselves were keeping off the books, it punctures that self-image in a way that is genuinely destabilizing for the regime. Think about what the leadership inside Iran is now forced to do. They have to conduct a security review that goes all the way to the core of their most protected institutions. They have to ask who talked. They have to ask what else is compromised. They have to ask whether the other facilities they believe are hidden are actually hidden. And they have to do all of this while publicly maintaining the posture that they are strong, undeterred, and ready to retaliate. The cognitive dissonance of that position is enormous. You cannot be simultaneously invulnerable and visibly struck. And this is where the Gulf threat and the Tehran strike become one story, not two. Iran's response to Israeli operations has traditionally followed a pattern: proxy escalation, missile barrages from Lebanon or Yemen, cyber attacks, targeted assassinations abroad. The direct confrontation has always been carefully managed to stay below a threshold that would invite American military involvement. But the hidden facility strike changes the risk calculus in a specific way. If what was struck relates to Iran's nuclear or advanced weapons program, and the secrecy surrounding the facility strongly suggests it does, then the Iranian leadership faces a choice that has no clean exit. Do you absorb the strike and allow the world to see that your most protected programs are vulnerable? Or do you escalate in a way that invites exactly the kind of international coalition you have spent decades trying to prevent? There's a third option, and this is the one that keeps people in Washington and Tel Aviv up at night. Iran could move on Hormuz not as a grand strategic play, but as a face-saving gesture. A temporary disruption. A show of force designed to tell its domestic audience and its regional proxies that the response was real and painful. Even a partial, temporary closure of the strait, even just the credible threat of mining operations in the shipping lane, would send oil prices spiking and send shockwaves through financial markets that are already fragile in 2025. And in that scenario, Iran doesn't need to win militarily. It just needs to impose enough cost on enough people to re-establish its deterrent credibility. This is the dangerous middle ground that nobody talks about enough. The scenarios that don't lead to full-scale war, but don't lead to stability either. The slow bleed of escalation and counter-escalation, each side probing for the limits of the other's tolerance, each strike and counter-strike raising the floor of what is considered normal. Because that normalization process, that gradual ratcheting up of what the international community considers acceptable, is how regions drift into wars that nobody planned and nobody wanted. You don't always get a moment where someone consciously decides to go to war. Sometimes you just look back 6 months later and realize you've been in one for a while, and nobody called it by its name. What should you be watching for in the days ahead? Not the statements from officials. Those are almost always lagging indicators, crafted for public consumption and diplomatic management. Watch the physical movements. Watch where the U.S. carrier groups position themselves in the Gulf region. Watch whether Israel signals any preparation for a second strike, because in Israeli military doctrine, a hidden facility that survived the first strike is not a completed mission. Watch the behavior of the Gulf monarchies. If Saudi Arabia or the UAE start moving their own assets or making unusual diplomatic contacts, that tells you they have threat intelligence that the public doesn't. And watch the oil markets, not as an economic signal, but as a geopolitical seismograph. The markets price in risk faster than any government briefing does. Because here's the truth about this moment that the comfortable framing of tensions in the Middle East always buries. The architecture of stability that held this region together for the last 3 decades, American military dominance, the implicit protection of Gulf oil infrastructure, the mutual deterrence between Israel and the Iranian axis, that architecture is under more simultaneous strain right now than at any point in the post-Cold War era. And the decisions being made in the next few weeks, in rooms we will never see, by people we will never hear from directly, will shape the energy prices you pay, the alliances your country relies on, and the security of a region where the wrong miscalculation doesn't stay regional for long. That's not a prediction of catastrophe, but it is a refusal to pretend this is routine. Because it isn't.